Hello and welcome to part 2 of my short series looking at political terminology. In part 1, I covered sort of the existing political parties and where they stand on my own hastily imagined left-right spectrum. And in this part 2, I'm going to go into theory more. So we're going to have a look at different theories and where they sit on the spectrum, ranging from sort of communism to fascism and all those political ideologies that aren't really active in the West at the moment. I'm going to show you what I think the underpinnings are, so what the actual defining feats of left-wing politics and right-wing politics are, and then I'm also going to spend some time going through the term liberal specifically, because I feel like that's a word that gets thrown around all the time and applied to very different ideologies. So I'm just going to go through the definition that I'm used to and trying to sort out what's what and who the real liberals are. Mostly I'll be going over terms that get used all the time in political discourse, but that we don't really ever stop and think about or define that often. So thanks again to Babudro-san for suggesting this topic. If you have any suggestions of a topic you'd like me to cover, any debater or debates you'd like me to analyse, please leave a comment down below and I'll get on that as soon as I can. Let's get started then on the topic of left and right in terms of theory. One good way of really crystallizing this issue, I always think, is the Spanish Civil War. So that was taking place in the 1930s in the lead up to World War II, and then I think during World War II. Not quite sure of the timeline. But essentially it was kind of an interesting left versus right battle, because on one side you had communists and anarchists and Republicans, like people who wanted it to be a democracy. And on the other side you had fascists and monarchists and conservatives. So it's like, okay, we understand those are all very different groups, and they sort of all aligned in terms of like left and right. But obviously like communists are very different to anarchists, who are very different to Republicans. So what was it that gave them like a unifying thing to fight for? What made them all left-wing as opposed to all the other parties that were all right-wing? So I'm going to go through the theoretical underpinnings now and try to answer that kind of question. What makes a group left or right? Here we go then. Here's my graph of theories. So it's a broader spectrum than the practical scale, which only showed the actual existing parties. These are like theoretical political ideologies that you might have, not all of which are active in the West at the moment. I think this one is like even less exact than my previous graph, but it's just to give you an idea. So far over here on the left, I'd say you have anarchists, people who want there to be no state, no rules as far as possible. You just hope that people will be basically good people and sort of try and get along. Then small state communists, which is kind of similar, except there's more organization on sort of a local level. Big state communists, so sort of like the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, which is like a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of people working for the state. I'm not really sure where you put that. I mean, it feels much more like a fascist state, so far right, but like its rhetoric is all left wing, and as we go into the theory, you'll see why that is. So then socialists, you sort of Jeremy Corbyns, your Bernies, sort of the far left of the practical political left wing that we talked about last time. Left of centre then are classic liberals, and I'll define what I mean by that in the second half of this video when I go over what liberals are, but they're kind of near the centre. Then to the right of those, conservatives. Remember here that when I mean conservatives, I don't mean the Conservative Party in the UK, which are sort of a more fixed right-wing position. I mean the ideology of conservatism, which is essentially that if things are working well, there's no need to change them. So normally the position is, well, the UK government basically works well enough, everyone seems happy enough, we'll just try and keep it going because any change might be change for the worse. That's the basic guiding principle. To the right of them, libertarians, who also want a very small state and let business run things. And this, I think, is one of the interesting problems that we'll get into, like why are anarchists over here on the far left, but libertarians are right of centre if they're both keen on a small state as their defining feature. We'll get into that more soon. Then elitists, which is kind of broad. I don't think anyone really endorses elitist political ideology, but I thought I'd put it in between sort of libertarians and monarchists. Just the idea that there should be a group of people who run things simply because they're the ones that are good at running it, and they don't necessarily need to be democratically elected. It's I put it to the right of libertarians because it's kind of similar. The idea would be that everything's run by either state institutions or businesses that are just run by what you might call technocrats nowadays, people who are just best for the job regardless of how they get there. And then I wasn't sure about monarchists and fascists, but like It'll depend on the form of monarchy, but obviously monarchists, they want a king or a queen, one monarch to make all the big decisions, and to the right of that, fascists, which is obviously usually an unelected, very strong leader with a lot of power that enforces their will militarily, usually by severely punishing anyone that steps out of very restrictive lines. Sometimes you might see a graph like this laid out on kind of an XY axis, where maybe it's sort of like freedom to authoritarianism on one side, and then like social and economic matters on another. And those are really helpful distinctions. I would say like the attitude to freedom is a big defining difference between the left and the right. The social and economic distinction is also really important because those are the two main things that any political ideology will need to worry about, like how to order social life and how to order economic life. So you get some socialists who think that the government should run everyone's economic life, but socially, in terms of their beliefs, their marriages, their relationships, their religion, the state has no right to interfere in that, just the bits that involve money. While those graphs are helpful, they still don't really address the question of what left-wingism is and what right-wingism is, and that's what we're looking at here today, so that doesn't really help. Very generalized sources like Google and Wikipedia, they try and define left and right wing like I did in the last video by just listing their common characteristics. So like internationalism on the left, anti-immigration on the right, maybe like commitment to freedom of speech nowadays on the right, while having sort of commitment to social outcomes more on the left. But that still doesn't say why those characteristics are attributed to certain groups. So the best thing I can come up with as a sort of unifying principle, if you like, of what's left-wing and what's right-wing is that left-wing groups try to bring power down the structure and spread it out so that more people can take part in power. And the right sends all the power to the top and tries to concentrate it. So that would be why anarchists are on the left and libertarians are on the right, because anarchists don't like any kind of power structure, including private businesses. So no one runs anything because no one can have power over anyone else. So power is like as evenly distributed among everyone as possible. So that's like the most left-wing theory. But libertarianism, because it still relies on big business, there still are powerful people who run aspects of other people's lives and that have a lot of control over what they do. And obviously businesses as conceived by libertarians and as we have them in the world today are not democratic. They are elitist structures really, if not like just openly authoritarian. Like you don't vote for your boss has obviously not total control over you, but a wide degree of control over what you do day to day. So power is sort of sent up and coalesces around them. And then sort of the most right-wing thing you can be is a fascist or an absolute monarch because you think that there's one person at the top who should have loads of power over everyone else, right? To sort of do what's best for them, is the theory. Communism then is the really difficult one because, as I say, in small state communism, that fits my theory of left-wingism very well because like decisions are taken locally and everyone takes part in them. So it's kind of like a slightly more organized form of anarchy where you still might have laws, but like they're sort of discussed between the people of that community. But big state communism, like the theory behind it is supposed to be left-wing. Like, oh, if you have a huge state that everybody works for, then power does go down and out because everyone will have a role in the state. And so everyone will have some degree of power over everyone else's life because the state runs everything. But in reality, it often looks like power actually coalesces around a few individuals who then end up having lots of power over other people, which would be right-wing according to my theory. Looked at in this way, then we can just say that the history of the UK for the past 1,000 years has just been getting more and more left-wing. I'm not saying that's inevitable, it's not like a Marxist statement or anything. It's just like, very generally speaking, we had absolute monarchs, right? All the power at the top. Then the barons started to rebel and we had Magna Carta, so we see power sort of comes down and gets spread. So the barons sort of take a share of the king's power. Then, sort of around the Civil War, Parliament starts getting more power, and you have sort of a few hundred MPs, and they now all have a share of that power. And then, as the franchise expands, people get to vote for them. You get sort of the landed gentry, they become rich, and in the new kind of society, being rich means being powerful. So sort of eventually, we go from the absolute monarch having all the power to it just slowly spreading out until now in a position where even sort of people at the bottom of society, if you like, sort of the working class, they're supposed to have a large degree of power over their own lives. There's no one like a monarch that can just ride up and be like, you need to do this right now and you need to listen to them. right? That's not how it works on paper. I'm never sure how much power, in a practical sense, workers in a capitalist society have over their own lives, but certainly more than serfs did in a monarchical state, that's for sure. Individual issues make sense when you look at it through this lens as well. Like the left champions things like abortion and gay marriage, because that's all about giving people more power over their own lives. And the right sort of is quite against immigration at the moment, for example. And that's kind of like a top-down, like we are the state and we have power and we want to stop people getting into the country. And I know libertarians talk a big game about being committed to freedom of speech and sort of individual freedoms and liberties, but that almost always translates into you need to go and work for a business who will actually control your life. And the person at the top of that business making all the money will be the one with the real freedom, right? They can actually walk out of the job if they want to because they have the money. They can, take a private jet around the world and that kind of thing. So that sort of libertarian idea of freedom, I think, is kind of a fake. I think the only way to really get people free is to follow the left-wing model, and obviously my biases are showing here. But I think that's the way to do it. Take power down and out so everyone has a large degree of power over their own lives with as little as possible control over other people's lives. So that's my attempt to provide a unifying principle for what is a left-wing policy and what is a right-wing policy. Just think about, who does this empower? Does it empower the great mass of people at the bottom, or does it empower the much smaller mass of people at the top of society who tend to make the decisions? The only other thing I want to go over for clarity's sake is the question of what is a liberal, which I think might be the most vexed question in modern political discourse. I think at some point, I guess during the 90s, in people's heads, liberal just sort of started to mean good politics. The phrase in the UK, at least, bleeding heart liberal, which means sort of someone who's emotional and caring sort of to a fault. And that motivates all their politics, right? They're always worried about who's worse off and how you can help them, which isn't a bad thing, obviously, but it has led to people using liberal as just a byword for nice politics. And as a result, lots of groups make claim to that title without actually being a liberal. So let's start off with the classical definition of what a liberal is. This is the definition used by John Stuart Mill and thinkers like that. So a classic liberal is mostly concerned with an individual's rights and freedoms, like their rights to find a job, their right to marry who they like, their right to follow whatever religion they like, a right to abortion, probably. And in that, the state acts as kind of like an insurance that you will keep your rights. So if the state isn't active enough, we might fall into a state of criminality, right? If the state doesn't do something about it, maybe a criminal gang will take over your town, and then you won't have any rights because they might rob you or you'll be scared all the time, and that's not good. So the state is there to make sure you keep your individual rights without interfering on other people's individual rights, except if you need to, if you need to send an exceptionally violent person to jail to save other people and protect their rights. So that's what the focus is on, individual rights and freedoms, like liberty, which is where the term liberal comes from. The confusion starts because that kind of liberal was typically in Western thought left-wing, and now in the American left, it's very common to just call these people liberals. And maybe I was wrong earlier because it is almost used as kind of a slur. I'm not even sure progressives want to call themselves liberals anymore, or if they just are happier with the term progressives. Certainly I wouldn't say that the progressive SJW type is very liberal. That's not to say it's bad or that it's worthless, but it's not primarily concerned with individual rights and freedoms. Those are still a factor, but they're really secondary. What they're mostly concerned with is achieving certain social outcomes, like equality of pay between men and women, equality of employment between all the races and sexualities and stuff. And they seem, in a lot of cases, quite willing to take people's rights and freedoms away. So you see people being kicked off social media because they're not contributing in the right way to the kind of political discourse that these progressives want to see. You might see people losing their jobs about it as well. Again, I don't want to say that progressivism is bad. I recognize it has very good intentions, but it's not mostly concerned with individual rights and freedoms, so it is not a liberal theory. This kind of liberal, the progressive liberal, doesn't seem to care where the authority comes from. They seem quite happy for private businesses to fire people or kick you off social media. And they also seem happy for the state to get involved and, criminally punish you, maybe a fine for sort of bad antisocial behavior in their view. Things get even more confusing then because there's a backlash from alt-right types like Sargon of Akkad, Paul Joseph Watson. I think Crowder finds himself as a liberal, but I could be wrong there. And what they've done is correctly pointed out that those progressives aren't liberals, but then they incorrectly define themselves as liberals when they're actually alt-right. The alt-right, as I said last time, really closer to some sort of civic nationalist view. So they claim to be all about individual rights and freedoms, and hey, we're very liberal, but we'd really probably rather there were fewer gay pride parades, and we're not that keen on abortion. And also, someone's right to immigration, I mean, kind of waive that one. So what you end up with is these progressives on the left that people call liberals, and these alt-right types on the right that call themselves liberals. Neither group is actually that liberal. They're actually quite similar. They actually all have certain social values that they would like the state and private business to enforce. They're just very cagey about it. At least the alt-right are very cagey about it. Like the progressives are quite openly just saying, here's how we'd like a top-down reorganization of society. The civic nationalist types are more sort of, oh no, we really care about individual rights and freedoms on paper. But you get the feeling if they got into power, they might start banning certain types of behavior pretty quickly. Because like the people on the left, they have an idea of the society they want to see, and they want to use the power of the state and private business to create that society, regardless of whether individuals want to be in that society or not. In the UK, at least, thankfully, progressives and alt-rights really have no kind of political power at all. They might have some sort of social cachet, like they might be able to bully people off social media or whatever, but I don't think there's any politician, or maybe a few that I call progressives, sort of in the Lib Dems and the Greens, and maybe a few I'd call alt-right on the far right of the Conservative Party and in fringe parties like UKIP and stuff like that. And I'm not sure the BNP have a consistent political philosophy. They're obviously very far right. So that's the comforting part for me, is that these groups that aren't very liberal aren't really in political power. The weird twist to all of this that I've been building up to is that we actually had a pretty good social liberal order through the 90s and the noughties, and most politicians seem maintained to keeping that order. They don't want things to change. They are conservatives, but it's a liberal order that they're endorsing. So it turns out the progressives aren't liberals, the alt-right aren't liberals. It's actually conservatives that are liberals, because we have a liberal social order and conservatives want to keep it the same, right? They don't want further progressive interference into trying to set these social goals, and they also don't want the alt-right banning abortion and gay marriage and stuff like that. So if you are a liberal, I hope that's some comfort at least. Politically, I don't think you need to worry about progressives, and I don't think you need to worry about the alt-right. Where I think the main threat to social liberty comes from is private business. Because, we quite happily sign over huge chunks of our lives and our rights to them, often for very little pay. If you're worried about your freedoms, you don't need to worry about these small fringe groups. They're just very loud because social media amplifies their voices, because social media thrives off controversy. Those aren't the people you need to worry about. The people you need to worry about are the CEOs and the middle managers that will just run you into the ground if given half the chance. So hopefully our socially liberal politicians keep their backbone and just get a bit more active in stopping private business having that kind of control over people's lives. I think workers' unions would be really helpful there, but in practice there's lots of problems, and this might all be a discussion for another video. So that's it for today. Hopefully I've helped define the theoretical underpinnings of left and right and what a liberal is, and hopefully you're less confused than you were before. As I said at the outset, a lot of this you just kind of have to learn by osmosis, and a lot of it is just pragmatic. In your social groups, people will come to a common understanding of what they mean by left and right wing, and it's just helpful to go with the common definition most of the time. Thanks very much to Babudro Sun for suggesting this topic. If you have anything else you'd like to suggest for me, please leave a comment down below. Also, a recommendation, if you want to learn more about this, I can't recommend highly enough Zarathustra's Serpent. Zarathustra's Serpent. It's the third time I've tried that. That's a different YouTube channel. He has a great series on the regressive left, which explains why these common progressive liberals aren't actually committed to real liberalism. He goes into a lot more detail than I do, and he's always fun to listen to. He has a short series on Buffy, which he uses to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV show, which he uses to exemplify differences between sort of classical liberal attitudes and new liberal attitudes. So that's great stuff. Give him a look. Until then, please leave a like if you like the video, share it with anyone you think might like it, leave a comment down below if you've got anything to add or anything to criticize. Until then, have a good one. Goodbye.